Okay, this is also joint work with Jonathan Eaton as well as Francis Cremars, who didn't get noted and he wasn't co-author in the previous paper, so bring attention to him. It's so what is his paper up to? As with the last paper, I'm gonna have to lead you through a little bit of the analytics, but what's the big picture? Well, over the past decade or two, there's been a lot of work in trade in bringing individual producers and producer heterogeneity into the picture. Rather than thinking of trade of a country, it's really trade of exports of individual firms and so on. And part of this paper is to go one step further and not just think of those individual participants in trade on the exporting side, but to think of them on the importing side as well. And to really go all the way to visualizing trade as kind of a network of connections between importers and exporters. Now, what are these individual importers? A way to think about it is that they're firms seeking intermediates to perform some of the production tasks that they're doing. So at the same time, we're going to be thinking of the interaction between these purchases of intermediates and employment at the firm level. So it gives us a way to connect trade and employment. And perhaps the main thing is to bring in the kind of firm level heterogeneity we see both in terms of how much firms import, their labor share, the extent to which they've outsourced workers and replaced them with intermediates, and also their exporting behavior, because we're going to include that as well as we have in previous work. Now, I'm going to actually start with some pictures of the data that include both the export side and the import side. And I'll start with the export side. This is something that we worked with in our previous paper with Francis. So in this peek at the data, I'm going to start with a picture that really kind of set the stage for our earlier work and challenged us in terms of the kind of models we came to the data thinking we were going to use. And basically what it's plotting is across a bunch of countries. This data set only covers European countries. So it's looking at the way that French exporters are attracted to these bigger markets in Europe. You see more firms selling there. Now that might seem obvious, but in fact we had written a model prior to seeing this data in which in the bigger markets, each firm would just sell more, but it wouldn't attract more firms to enter that market. It would just be each firm would sell twice as much in a bigger market. Yet that was clearly not capturing a kind of first order fact in the data. To see this in even a sharper image, you can kind of take account of French market share in each market and look at the number of French exporters relative to their market share, and it kind of comes into focus even more. This is very similar to what we had found. This is data for 2005. We had found something very similar in the data we had used before, which was actually 1986 data. So this does seem to be quite a robust fact. And now let's look at it from the other side. Let's look at a little bit from the buyer side. And basically, the number of buyers is going to kind of scale up with the number of sellers. But something else comes out, which is that the buyers per exporter tends to go up in these bigger markets. So that's kind of a first fact we'll want to capture with our model about the individual buyers. Now to look at that buyer side in a little more detail, we can, I just grabbed a couple countries. Let me just show you where they are. Lithuania is LP there, way over on the left. Then you kind of go up an order of magnitude in market size, and you get to Denmark, go up another order of magnitude, and you get to GB, Great Britain, the UK, and then go to the biggest country, Germany. Those are the ones I'm looking at here. So I wanted to kind of span the country size dimension. And what you see here is, first of all, what had hardly any change at all, but very skewed distribution, so that at the upper end, there's a lot of action at the upper end, and it varies tremendously across countries, hence generating the big changes in the means that we saw before. Now, I'm using these pictures as sort of a motivation for this theory. There's a whole other dimension of it having to do with replacing employment, and that I'm not going to motivate with data, but jump right into the model to give you a sense of what's going on. But we're not the first to think about these issues, and in particular, there's, in a sense, we want to kind of be as much out in front of the game as possible in terms of all the data that's becoming available on the importer side and the matched importer-exporter type data. And there's a vast literature there, growing literature, that we want to tie into with the kind of model we're talking about here. But in terms of our analytical framework, I think the three most notable papers that we build on are Arminter and Koren, who think about how far you can go with a model of trade, which is purely sort of probabilistic, without much economics at all. It's sort of a challenge that, to what extent are the facts we're uncovering just explained by a purely random model with very little economics? Well, in a sense, we're going to be building a model of that nature, but with a little bit of economics, and it actually aggregates up into a fairly familiar model for aggregates. It's also related to Thomas' work, Thomas Schnee's work on buyer-supplier networks, and perhaps most closely to Ezra Oberfield's recent paper on interactions between intermediate suppliers and firms, and in particular sort of looking for a sort of completion of the model where the model itself generates a set of firms who are interacting with other firms, and those two, that interaction completes itself. So I'll get into what I mean by that in a moment, in the way it shows up in this model. Now, the basic model is pretty standard. We just have a bunch of countries, separated goods move across countries with iceberg trade costs. There's a continuum of heterogeneous firms, as in a lot of recent work. The new part here is that the output of those firms can be purchased by individual consumers or by other firms who are using that output as an input in their own production. Each buyer encounters only a handful of suppliers, so it's sort of a search theoretic model in that sense. There's a continuum of producers out there, but there are only a small number of them who have what you need as a firm looking for an intermediate input. And to keep it as simple and stark as possible, and maybe to contrast it with previous models that have confronted the kind of data we're going to be looking at, we're making the buyers have all the bargaining power so that there's marginal cost pricing. And one of the things that I failed to know when I was showing you the picture before is that we're going to try and fit a model like data like we saw there of more exporters entering into bigger markets without any kind of fixed cost, without any perfect competition, but purely through the workings of this search model of interactions between buyers and sellers. In that way, kind of Arminter and Koren-like. Okay. Now, the way that we make the intermediate demand precise is to think that the firm is carrying out a bunch of tasks. So those are all the things. Each task is something that has to get done, and it can use either an intermediate Okay. Um, so what are the inputs into performing these tasks are, as I mentioned, either a worker. Now a worker has a wage and it has a random efficiency, or an intermediate good which has a random price because of the randomness of the search process, who your luck, the draw in choosing an intermediate producer for yourself. And then there's a cost of carrying out the task in the end, which is just the minimum of carrying it out with labor, which is the cost there is just the wage divided by the efficiency, or carrying it out by purchasing this intermediate instead at a price of pk. Okay, production. For production, you're just combining the output of these tasks with in a Cobb-Douglas production function with shares beta k. Or in a household, you're doing the same thing with shares alpha k. So it's very symmetric there. And then when you try and think about typically our models of heterogeneous firms in trade, they have heterogeneity in firm efficiency. Well, we have this other dimension of heterogeneity, which is the extent to which you found cheap ways to carry out these tasks through the luck of the draw. So there are these two dimensions of cost heterogeneity. Okay, so in terms of the primitives at the country level, there are two things. There's the quantity of labor you have that's capable of doing different tasks. So the idea is there's types of labor indexed by L which can perform a set of tasks K, and then so between all the different types of labor you could carry out all the tasks, but the tasks are sort of allocated to different types of labor. And the country is endowed with fixed quantities of those different types. So think of, skilled, unskilled, production, non-production, and so on. And then the country's also endowed with a measure of firms with efficiency above Z for all different values of Z that you could imagine. And that element of the model is exactly what we've used in the past, and Thomas Chenet's used in the past, and it fits into the Melitz model and so on. So that's kind of a continuity from earlier models. Okay, so what makes this thing run is really some particular distributional assumptions. The first one is what's been found to be a very useful assumption in the Melitz model, to model the distribution of firm efficiencies in this way, where country I, if it has a lot of good firms, it has a high value of this parameter Ti, and then theta governs sort of the extent to which at higher levels of efficiency there are fewer firms that can run at that level of efficiency. So that's been used, that assumption's been used a lot in the past. The second distributional assumption is on the probability distribution for the efficiency of labor, which is idiosyncratic. It's the efficiency of labor at a given task at a given firm. That has this Frechet form here, where the parameter phi is going to be less than or equal to the parameter theta. And then finally, there's the Poisson intensity with which a buyer encounters a firm selling an input that could perform task K for that firm. And that's an intensity, not a Poisson parameter yet. It has to be sort of integrated over some measure of suppliers to become a Poisson parameter, but that intensity is related to the cost of the supplier, so that you're more likely to know about low-cost suppliers. That's governed by that parameter, what we call funny phi. And then lambda ki is kind of the search friction, and a higher lambda ki means you know about more potential suppliers. Okay, so where do we go from there? Okay, I should acknowledge this is sort of a major simplification comes out of this parameter restriction here. So I'm going to try and motivate why that's, you know, it's not natural, but it's very, it leads to some very natural results. So result 1. Okay, you got to cut into this model. It's kind of circular in that firms have efficiency. There's a cost distribution that generates a price distribution that generates the prices of intermediates, which in turn firms are using, and that affects their costs, and that affects the cost distribution. So there's this sort of circle. You got to cut in somewhere. We're going to cut in with this conjecture, which is that the measure of suppliers available to country N at a cost less than C, or that can supply country N at a cost less than C, is related to some parameter which we'll solve for in the end, this epsilon n, and then it's going to be proportional to C to the theta. Okay, starting from there, we can build up results until finally we can verify that conjecture. So the first part is that we can say, what is the Poisson number of suppliers with a cost below C that a firm will encounter? And then it's going to choose among those the one that's cheapest. So that's going to be an integer number. This is it's going to be a realization of a Poisson with a parameter, Poisson parameter given by this rho. And all you're doing here is integrating over the measures of firms whose cost is below C. You're integrating that intensity, that Poisson intensity term, the encounter term, the E. And when you do that integration, you end up with the term on the right. Okay. Now you say, well, what's the chance okay, so now I'm a firm that's buying, and I can say, what's the chance that I'm going to find an intermediate supplier who's with a price less than CK? Well, it's just 1 minus the probability that I got a realization of 0 on that Poisson distribution above, and that's e to the minus rho. So 1 minus e to the minus rho is my intermediate price distribution. Now, what we really want to know is the distribution of the costs of carrying out tasks, and those can all be, they could be carried out by using an intermediate or by using labor, by using workers. Now, the workers have this quality distribution, so you say, what's the probability that the cost of carrying out a task is less than CK? Well, that's 1 minus the probability you can't find a price less than CK, and you can't find a worker, the worker can't do it at a cost less than CK either. So therefore, the minimum cost is going to be above CK. 1 minus that is the probability that minimum cost will be below CK. And that turns out to have this form 1 minus E to a parameter given here. And to just walk through the 2 parts of that parameter, the first part has to do with the rate of arrival of the intermediates, and the second has to do with the wage of labor. So if labor becomes more expensive, it's less likely that you can get your task done at a cost less than CK. And then this result also gives you the probability that at the firm level that any given task will be carried out by a worker, and it's just the wage. That actually should have been a fee, not a theta. I'm sorry, because it should have been the same as that one. That should have been a fee relative to this xi. So that gives you these sorts of outsourcing probabilities, or 1 minus the outsourcing probability for task K at a given firm. But it's all at the firm. It's all 1, 0. You know, these are individual probabilities. But then at the aggregate, you get a nice labor share. You get a labor share for type L workers, which is just the sum of those probabilities over the Cobb-Douglas share of that task. And so that's something we can match the data. But again, remember, at the firm level, it's all 0, 1. Either we're using a worker or we're using an intermediate. It's going to be one or the other. Okay, now, we wanted to complete the circle. I said we were cutting into the circle. Now let's see if we get back to where we started. And the way to do that is to say, well, what is the measure of firms from country integral over all the different tasks of the measure of firms who can, given a cost of inputs, can deliver at a cost less than C, and then we got to integrate over these cost distributions which we derived, the G's. Well, we got a fairly simple formula for them, and it turns out that allows you to perform this integration, and you get this term here, the middle term here from UNIFC. And you can start to see it might work as it's proportional to C to the theta. And then you sum it up over all the different countries of the world, and you get back our starting point, which is upsilon n C to the theta, which is what we assumed to begin with. And now we have an equation for upsilon n, which is the sum of these terms here without the C, the sum of these terms across all the different i's. So all the different countries of the world are contributing to this low cost of inputs to country N. Okay, I want to watch the time. So let's see, this is maybe the last thing I really need to do, which is to just talk a little about the other side, the number of customers. See, up till now we've been talking about, from the point of view of a firm that wants an intermediate, how many suppliers is it going to see? Now let's look at it from the other point of view, from the point of view of a supplier, how many customers is it going to see? Because we have both sides of the market working here. And that firm, now imagine a firm with cost C selling in country N. Well, it has all the final consumers who are the workers in that country, Ln. It has all the potential firms, the Mn is the number of firms who are operating in country N. And then it can encounter any of them, and it will be the low cost with that probability e to the minus I c to the phi, because it's just, that's the probability that everybody else that that customer sees has a higher cost than the firm that we're talking about whose cost is C. And so that gives the Poisson number of customers in country N. Now you go around the world and say, well, it could be selling anywhere. So we sum up those Poisson parameters around the world, taking into account trade costs. And then we say, what's the probability that a firm will exist, that it will have at least one customer if its cost is C, and that's just 1 minus the probability it got a 0 in that Poisson outcome. So that's that term. And that term integrated over the cost distribution gives us the equation for MI, and so then we have a fixed point where we have an MI equation depending on Mn, and we solve for the whole vector of entrance in each country. Okay, time to get to, okay, this model gives a gravity type relationship, which I show there. It gives a cost of living index. And you can think of it, if I've totally lost you in describing the micro details of this model, it turns out you can think of it as just an aggregate CES production function in the nature of Hautacker, where you have a bunch of heterogeneous firms, and when you aggregate over them, you have a well-behaved aggregate production function. And for us, it'll be this kind of nested CES with Cobb-Douglas on the outside and CES on the inner nest with an elasticity of substitution 1 plus B. Okay, so I want to get to these numerical explorations while we still have some time. So, because I think to some degree, you might understand the model more easily by just kind of seeing what comes out of it. So we're going to pick some parameters. We have to pick those couple of Pareto parameters. We just normalize the world labor force to be 1. We basically make the technology levels neutral across countries. We're going to have 6 countries with different size labor forces where the sum of those equals 1. We're going to say that 60% of the workers are non-production and 40% production workers. Those are going to be our 2 skill types. We're going to have 12 tasks for the production workers, 4 tasks for the non-production workers. We're going to say the non-production workers can't be outsourced, so those tasks are always performed by labor. The production tasks can be outsourced, so often those So what happens, so then we solve the model, the general equilibrium of the model where, meaning wages are endogenous as kind of labor demand, and then we had our fixed labor supplies in each country. What do we get? Well, part of the reason I put all those non-production workers in there with a big share is to get a realistic manufacturing share of GDP, and that's what you're seeing there. In these countries of different sizes as determined by their labor force, going from 0.001 up to 0.4, then we get a share of manufacturing value in GDP of about 13%, similar to the US economy. The next line shows us the share of value added as a share of manufacturing gross production. And there we're getting numbers like 20 to 25%, meaning the other share, the remaining 75% share is intermediate. We get our fraction of tasks outsourced, about 60% of tasks are outsourced. More in the bigger countries. The bigger countries are sort of more natural manufacturing places, and so they use more roundabout production because intermediates are cheaper there. That actually, when you look at the production wage here, it actually drives down the production wage in the big countries, but it drives up the non-production worker wage because they're sort of sitting there. They can't be outsourced, and they're kind of near the place that's good at manufacturing. So we get a big skill premium for non-production over production workers in the bigger markets. And we get real wages rising in the bigger markets, although not for production workers, but the aggregate real per capita consumption goes up in the bigger markets, even though the production workers do less well in the big markets. Okay, do I have 5 minutes? Okay. So I want to now take you through a couple of results on the firm level and end with some pictures that are kind of the analogs of the pictures I started with. That's why I was desperate to get through this part. So what we're looking at here is this endogenous number of firms that enter different markets, and that was the M variable that we talked about right at the end of the model section. So the number of firms is, of course, much bigger in the big markets. The number of firms selling in a market is also much bigger, but is a little less skewed than the number of firms producing. So there tends to be, if you looked at it relative to the labor force, the number of firms producing goes up relative to the labor force in the big markets. The number of firms selling goes down relative to the labor force in the big market. What's going on is in a little market, the average firm selling there isn't selling to very many customers, and that's sort of behind this result, whereas in the big market, it tends to be selling to a lot of customers. And we saw that in the data. Here's what's coming out of the simulation for that mean number of customers per firm. Notice how that's rising from 1 up to 6 as we go from the small market to the bigger market. And then a challenge in this model was to then get this skewness in the distribution of number of customers per buyers per supplier. And at least in the bigger markets, we're starting to get that, where at the lower end we have a median of 1 or 2 buyers per seller, but in the big markets we're getting up to 55 for the 99th percentile. So now let's see how we do on this fact that had been a challenge for our earlier models. It didn't have a scale effect. Kind of pushed us towards, in our earlier work, using a Melitz model where there's a fixed entry cost. And now we're taking a model where really there's no explicit entry cost, but there are these search frictions which generate something similar. And lo and behold, we are getting this relationship between the number of suppliers from a given source who enter markets and finding that more of them enter the larger markets with an elasticity similar to what we were seeing in the data, elasticity of about 0.6 or 0.7, which is also what we had found in our earlier work. So the bigger markets explicitly paying a fixed cost that is spread over more earnings in a bigger market. There are no profits here. It's just that naturally through this stochastic process, you'll end up pulling in more suppliers into a bigger market. And then the second thing is that we also capture this fact about buyers per supplier going up in the bigger market. So the bigger markets tend to, each guy who's entered that market tends to get more customers, and that's something that we saw in the data as well. So I've only given you a very, a small sampling of what this model can do and tried to relate it to some data, but our job is to really link it to more dimensions of the data in future work. I think that's my last slide.
We've got a few minutes, so if you have questions either for Jonathan or Sam.
I have a question for Sam. If I understand correctly, your data basically is based on the GDP and the trade ratio. Is the trade is only import or export, or the sum of the import and exports, the trade to GDP ratio.
Oh, yeah, me.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
I'm sorry.
Well, we had different things in different diagrams. Some of those had just imports to GDP.
Okay.
Some of them had imports plus exports.
So then my question is, because they have a two paper right now in the Journal of Economic Perspective to introduce the value-added trade, just certain ratio of this year.
Oh, the value-added trade.
Value-added trade. If you change the ratio from the value-added, from the gross trade number to the value-added trade number, I think the plumbing of the recession will be much smaller.
The decline.
The decline will be much smaller. So I think that should be true, because you say the trade data is based on gross term.
Yeah.
The GDP data is based on value-added term. So those two standards are different. It's not on the SNA standard.
Yeah.
So right now it's OECD and WHO and the UN is to promote the change the trade measures in giving another perspective from the value-added side. So that means if you put into change the value-added data, what influence in your results?
So that's a good point. And the model implicitly is making predictions about that, which we haven't explored. And that's a good idea. Well, thank you.
And now the data is available, right?
Yeah.
The data is, you only have four sectors. Is right?
Yeah, we aggregated.
Okay, but you only have four sectors.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right.
So
That's right.
the value data that provides 37 sectors.
Yeah. Well, we have data for more disaggregated, but we aggregated it for the purposes of our model.
Does that mean the data is, if you see the website, they have a data from 95 to 2011. So that's kind of fitting. So it's really worth to